High explosives are a lot like disrespect. Mishandle them once, and there won't be a second chance. My name is Eugene Tomaselli, but everyone on a job site just calls me Gene. I'm 58 years old, and for the last 32 of them, I was the senior blasting engineer for Daikon Demolitions. In simpler terms, I was the man who made skyscrapers disappear. The kid sitting across the polished mahogany desk didn't look up from his laptop. His name was Blake Worthington. He was 28, with a fresh Princeton MBA hanging on the wall behind him, framed in something dark and expensive. It looked like it had been delivered yesterday. Gene, he said, the name sounding foreign in his mouth. He pronounced it like a brand he was thinking of acquiring. We're moving into a new phase of operational synergy, a digital transformation. I said nothing. My hands, thick with calluses from 3 decades of handling detonator wire and climbing steel skeletons, rested on my knees. They looked out of place in this sterile environment, a room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and his Tom Ford cologne. He finally closed the laptop, a silver machine thin as a credit card. He steepled his fingers. His hands were soft, pale, and looked like they'd never held anything heavier than a champagne flute. Your approach, he continued, his eyes finally meeting mine. It's analog. We're implementing a new integrated system. Predictive modeling, AI-driven stress analysis. Your methodologies are a legacy liability. Legacy. That was the word he used. I had built this division from nothing. I had personally overseen 47 major implosions for Daikon, from the Old Kingdom in Seattle to the Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. My name was the one the insurance underwriters looked for on a policy. I was the guy Old Man Harrison, Blake's grandfather, called when a project got complicated and the lawyers started circling. Now his grandson was calling me a liability. I glanced at the Patek Philippe on his wrist. It probably cost more than my 1999 Ford Ranger, which was parked faithfully in the employee lot, covered in a fine layer of dust from the Halcyon Tower site. If you love stories about underdogs who refuse to stay down, and the sweet justice that comes when experience meets arrogance, hit that like button and subscribe right now. We appreciate your years of service, he said, the words clearly read from a mental script provided by human resources. But your time here is over. We need people who are agile. He pushed a manila envelope across the desk. It slid to a stop a few inches from my hand. The severance package. 32 years of my life, condensed into a few sheets of paper and a check that wouldn't cover my son Leo's next 2 semesters at Purdue. I didn't reach for it. I just looked at him. A dead calm settled over me. There was no anger, no panic, just a cold, sharp clarity. It's the same feeling I get in the final seconds before. A blast, when the countdown hits 3 and the world holds its breath. It's the moment you know for certain if you did your job right. I understand, I said. My voice was even. He seemed surprised by my lack of protest. A flicker of relief crossed his face. He'd clearly been expecting a scene. Good, he said, already turning back to his laptop. HR will handle the exit interview. The door is right there. I stood up. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught the preliminary blueprints for the Halcyon Tower project, pinned to a corkboard on the wall. It was a $40 million contract, the biggest in Daikon's history. A 42-story office building downtown, wedged between a historic landmark and the city's new transit hub. The margin for error was 0. A surgical takedown. My masterpiece. Or it was supposed to be. I walked out of his office, down the hallway I'd walked for over 3 decades, and didn't look back. I surrendered my badge and keycard to the security guard at the front desk. The plastic felt weightless in my hand. For the first time in my adult life, I was a man without access. But what Blake Worthington didn't understand was that access isn't about a keycard. It's about what you know. And in my wallet, tucked behind my driver's license, was a worn, laminated card issued by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, firearms, and explosives. It designated me as a federally licensed Class A Master Blaster, and I was the only one in a 4-state radius legally permitted to sign off on the kind of work the Halcyon Tower required. That same evening, I didn't tell my wife, Sarah. Not right away. I came home, washed the grime of the city off my hands, and sat at the kitchen table while she made dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the small house we'd lived in for 25 years. I looked at the framed photo on the mantelpiece. Me, Sarah, and a 7-year-old Leo at his first baseball game. I had missed more of his games than I'd attended. There was always a job, always a deadline, always a structure that needed to come down. I had sacrificed time with my family for loyalty to a company that had just dismissed me with a buzzword. The breaking point came in February 2020. That was when Old Man Harrison officially retired and handed the reins to his daughter, who promptly installed her son, Blake, as Chief Operating Officer. Harrison had started Dicon with a single Caterpillar bulldozer and a handshake deal in 1978. He understood grit. He knew that buildings weren't brought down by algorithms, but by men who understood physics in their bones. I remembered a conversation with Harrison years ago, back in 2013, after a particularly nasty job in Philadelphia. We were taking down an old factory, and the city council was breathing down our necks about vibration damage to a nearby church. "Gene," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder, his hand like a leather work glove. "These suits, these lawyers, they live on paper, but we live on bedrock. Never forget that what you know," he tapped his temple, "is worth more than any contract they can write." He was the one who insisted I get the Class A license. The company paid for the training, the certifications, the extensive background checks. It was an investment. "You're our ace in the hole, Gene," he'd told me. "The one thing the competition can't buy or replicate." Blake saw none of that. He saw an aging employee with a salary of $185,000 a year that could be replaced by a software subscription and a couple of junior engineers at half the cost. He saw a line item on a spreadsheet, an inefficiency to be optimized. He had the MBA, the title, the Armani suit. But he didn't have the institutional memory. He didn't know the history. He didn't know about the handshake deals, the verbal agreements, the foundation upon which the entire company was built. He was the guy you called to impress investors. I was the guy you called when the lawyers were circling and a building was leaning the wrong way. Blake had never understood the difference. He thought authority came from his title. He was about to learn that real control comes from being the only man who can solve an unsolvable problem. For the next 2 days, I did nothing. I didn't answer the calls from my old crew, guys I'd trusted with my life. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't update my resume. I performed maintenance on my 1999 Ford Ranger, changing the oil and rotating the tires. I cleaned my hunting rifle. I packed a duffel bag with thermal gear, a thermos, and enough supplies for a few days off the grid. I was methodical, patient. I knew the timeline for the Halcyon project down to the hour. They had a 72-hour window to place the charges before the city permits expired. That window opened in 3 days. I knew for sure 3 weeks ago that this was coming. I'd seen the memos from Blake about right-sizing and future-proofing our talent pipeline. Corporate jargon for cutting experienced, expensive people. I'd started quietly moving my personal files, my detailed notebooks with 2 decades of blast calculations, from my office to my truck. Not because I planned this, but because a man in my line of work always prepares for the worst-case scenario. You always have an exit strategy. Back at Dicon, Blake was celebrating. I could picture it perfectly. He'd sent out a company-wide email full of his usual empty phrases. A new era of innovation. Streamlining for a dynamic future. He probably held a meeting where he unveiled a PowerPoint presentation with charts showing the projected cost savings from my termination. He saw it as his first decisive act as a leader, cutting the dead weight. What he hadn't realized was that he hadn't just cut an employee. He'd cut the single point of failure he didn't even know existed. He assumed my federal license was a formality, a piece of paperwork HR could handle. He likely delegated the task of finding a replacement to some junior manager, who in turn handed it to an intern. "Find us another blaster," he would have said, as if ordering a new stapler. The intern would have started with a Google search. Then they'd have gone to the ATF's public registry of federal explosives licensees. They would have filtered by Class A blaster and urban high-rise implosion. The list would have been short. Then they would have cross-referenced it with specialists insured for projects exceeding $20 million in potential collateral damage. The list would have gotten shorter. Finally, they would have searched for someone available to start work in downtown Chicago in the next 48 hours. And the list would have shown one name, Eugene Tomaselli. The quiet execution began on a Wednesday morning. That was the day the prep team was scheduled to begin drilling the support columns at the Halcyon Tower, placing the nests for the explosive charges. But they couldn't start. Per federal law and the city ordinance, the supervising master blaster had to be on site to approve the drilling plan. Every hole, every angle, every depth, it all required my signature before a single drill bit could touch concrete. The site foreman, a good man named Dave Jensen, would have been the first to raise the alarm. He would have called his supervisor. The supervisor would have called the project manager. The calls would have started climbing the ladder, each one carrying a greater sense of urgency. Communication overload. That's the first sign of systemic collapse. Memos and emails would be flying. Blake's phone would have started buzzing with messages he initially dismissed as operational noise. By Wednesday afternoon, the client would have called. The developer for the Halcyon Tower was a notoriously aggressive firm from New York. Their representative, a man with the patience of a starving wolf, would have demanded to know why the site was idle. The contract had penalty clauses, stiff ones. Every 24-hour delay past the deadline cost Dicon $250,000. Blake, ever confident, would have assured them it was a minor logistical hiccup, a staffing issue being resolved. He would have projected calm while his insides were starting to churn. By Thursday morning, the panic would be real. The intern's report would have finally made it to his desk. It would have been a single sheet of paper stating the facts plainly. No other licensed and insured blaster was available. The nearest qualified expert was in Colorado, and he was booked for the next 6 months. The others were either retired or lacked the specific insurance riders for a downtown Chicago job. System failure. Blake's new AI-driven software could model 1 million blast scenarios, but it couldn't sign a federal document. His entire digital transformation was being held up by a single, stubbornly analog requirement: a signature. My signature. The junior engineers he'd championed couldn't help. They could run simulations, but they didn't have my notebooks. They didn't know the unique properties of the high-tensile steel used in the Halcyon Tower's 1978 construction, a detail I'd discovered only by poring over the original architect's microfiche records. Their models were useless without the right data. They were trying to fly a plane without knowing how to build the engine. The financial bleeding had begun. 2 days of delays. $500,000 in penalties. Gone. The board of directors, including his grandfather, would be demanding answers. The confidence of the 28-year-old Princeton man would be cracking, the expensive facade crumbling under the weight of a problem he couldn't solve with a spreadsheet. He had the authority, but I had the control. He was just now beginning to understand the difference. On Thursday evening, I drove my Ford Ranger north, leaving the city lights in my rearview mirror. I drove for 5 hours, into the deep woods of northern Wisconsin, to a small plot of land I'd bought 15 years ago. I parked the truck, hiked a mile into the woods under a canopy of stars, and climbed into the deer stand I'd built with my own 2 hands. The air was cold and clean. It smelled of pine and damp earth. There was no sound, but the wind rustling through the leaves. I poured a cup of coffee from my thermos and settled in. I wasn't there to hunt. I was there to wait. The call came at 7:15 a.m. on Friday, right on schedule. My phone, an old flip model with a cracked screen, buzzed against the wooden platform of the stand. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm. "Gene? Is this Gene Tomaselli?" The voice on the other end was strained, high-pitched. It was Blake. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "This is him," I replied. "Gene, it's Blake Worthington. From Dicon." As if I could forget. "Listen, there's been a misunderstanding, a clerical error. We need you to come back." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The silence stretched out. I could hear him breathing, short, shallow breaths. "A misunderstanding?" I asked. "It seemed pretty clear to me. You said my time was over. You said you needed people who were agile." "Look, that was a mistake," he stammered. "The Halcyon project. We're stalled. We need your license. We need you to sign off." Here it was. The moment of reversal. The point where the lever finds its fulcrum and the weight of the world shifts. "You don't need me, Blake," I said evenly. "You have your predictive models, your AI, your digital transformation. Surely one of them can sign a piece of paper." "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "We're losing $250,000 a day. The board is going to fire me. My grandfather—" He trailed off. "I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand that you have a $40 million contract on the line, and the only thing standing between you and catastrophic failure is a man you called a legacy liability 2 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. He was probably looking at the penalty clause in the contract right now, watching the numbers climb. "What do you want?" he finally asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your job back? A raise? I can offer you $200,000. $250. Just name your price." I looked out from the deer stand at the sun filtering through the autumn leaves. A buck was picking its way through the underbrush about 100 yards out. A beautiful 8-point. It was a perfect morning. "I'm hunting now, Blake," I said, my voice as cold and still as the morning air. "But I'll come back." I let him hang on that for a second. Let the hope flicker. "I'll come back," I repeated, "for the CEO title, a public apology to be sent to every employee in this company, and your desk cleaned out by the time I arrive. I want your car, your title, your office, and your parking space. I want a new employment contract drafted by my lawyer, giving me a 5-year term at $1.2 million a year, plus a seat on the board of directors. Those are my terms. Non-negotiable." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the circuits in his Princeton-educated brain frying. He was trying to process a reality that his textbooks had never prepared him for. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "High explosives are a lot like disrespect, Blake. Mishandle them once. You don't get a second chance. You have 1 hour to have your grandfather call me back and confirm my terms. If I don't hear from him, my price goes up. And tell him to find a new blaster. Good luck with that." I ended the call. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned the phone off and placed it in my bag. The buck was still there, oblivious. I raised my rifle, looked through the scope, and then lowered it again. I had bigger game in my sights today. 42 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I did recognize. It was Old Man Harrison's private line. It said, "Terms accepted. See you Monday, Mr. CEO." I drove back to the city on Sunday afternoon. I didn't speed. I stopped at a roadside diner in Wisconsin, Murphy's Diner, and had a pot roast that tasted like victory. I took my time. The world had waited 32 years for me to be in charge. It could wait a few more hours. When I pulled my 1999 Ford Ranger into the executive parking garage at Dicon headquarters on Monday morning, Blake's reserved spot was empty. A new plaque was already being installed. It read, E. Tomaselli, CEO. Old Man Harrison was waiting for me in the lobby. He was 84 now, walking with a cane, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He wore a simple tweed jacket, not a custom Brooks Brothers suit like his grandson. He walked over and extended a hand. His grip was still firm. "Gene," he said, a small, wry smile on his face. "You look good behind the wheel." "I'm not the one who crashed the car, William," I replied. He nodded. The boy was a fool. Ambitious, but a fool. He confused a diploma with an education. He's gone. The board approved your appointment an hour ago. Unanimously. As we walked toward the executive elevator, a security guard passed us, pushing a dolly with 3 cardboard boxes. Inside, I could see a framed MBA, a set of golf clubs, and a pair of Tom Ford sunglasses resting on a stack of books about corporate synergy. Blake was nowhere to be seen. He'd been escorted from the building before sunrise, a quiet, unceremonious end to a brief and disastrous reign. The other executives, the ones who had stood by silently in meetings while Blake ridiculed my methods, were now lining the hallway, eager to shake my hand. I looked at each of them. I didn't smile. They were enablers, men who had traded their integrity for job security. Their silence had amplified the injustice. They knew their positions were now dependent on my goodwill. I wouldn't fire them. Not yet. It was better to have them nervous and eager to please. Fear is a more effective motivator than loyalty. My new office was on the top floor. It had a panoramic view of the city, including the Halcyon Tower, still standing silent and waiting. The faint outline of Blake's Princeton diploma was visible on the wall where it had hung. His expensive cologne still lingered in the air. The first thing I did was call Dave Jensen, the site foreman. "Dave, it's Gene," I said. "Get the crew ready. I'm on my way." The second thing I did was have HR draft the public apology. It went out in a company-wide email an hour later. It acknowledged the gross misjudgment in my termination and reaffirmed the company's commitment to the irreplaceable value of hands-on experience. Then I got to work. I spent the next 48 hours living at the Halcyon site. I walked every floor, checked every support column, and recalculated every charge myself. I used my old notebooks, the ones filled with decades of handwritten equations and observations. I didn't use Blake's software. I used experience. The implosion was scheduled for the following Sunday at dawn. It went off without a hitch. The 42-story building folded into itself as gracefully as a closing fan, collapsing into its own footprint with a low, satisfying rumble. The dust cloud was minimal. The vibration readings were well within the city's limits. The historic church next door didn't lose a single pane of stained glass. It was a perfect takedown, a masterpiece. That night, for the first time in years, I was home for dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, and we ate in comfortable silence. I wasn't on call. My phone wasn't buzzing with emergencies. The weight of providing for my family was still there, but it was a weight I now carried on my own terms. Later, I sat in my new office, the city lights twinkling below me. I took the worn, laminated ATF license from my wallet and placed it on the vast mahogany desk. It looked small and insignificant in the cavernous room, but it was the only thing that had mattered. It was the key to the castle. I thought about Blake Worthington. He had a prestigious degree, a powerful family, and a vocabulary full of the latest business school buzzwords. He had everything he needed to succeed, except for one thing: respect for the work. He thought he was cutting dead weight, but he didn't realize he was cutting the brake lines. He saw the world as a series of systems to be optimized, but he never understood that some assets don't show up on a spreadsheet. Control isn't in the title on the door or the diploma on the wall. It's not in the suit you wear or the car you drive. Real control is in the contracts, in the regulations and in the knowledge that no one else has. It's in being the only person who can turn the key. They had the authority to fire me, but they never had the power. That was the lesson they paid $1.2 million a year for me to teach them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the story. Leave a comment below telling me what you think Blake is doing now. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of sweet cold justice.